I went into this thinking I was about to play Lucila's Segue, and honestly, that made sense. She was the character attached to it. She had been getting more focused throughout Lahai-Roi, and it felt like this was finally going to be the story that put her fully in the spotlight. But after finishing it, that label started feeling a little too small. Not wrong exactly, just incomplete. Because the more I sat with the story, the less it felt like it was only trying to close Lucila's arc. There was something bigger happening here, something about the students, something about the Rebel College, something about what Lahai-Roi leaves behind after the Exosrider is gone, and that surprised me because I was actually a little worried going into this. After the Edgerunner collab, Wuthering Waves had just delivered one of the most emotionally charged stories I've played in a gacha game, so part of me wondered if this segue was going to feel overshadowed. Not because it would be bad, but because it was coming right after something that heavy, and yet, somehow, that did not happen. If anything, this story found a completely different emotional space. It was quieter, more reflective, less about one devastating goodbye and more about the whole place trying to understand what it becomes after its purpose changes. So today I want to talk about why this segue worked better than I expected, why Lucila was only part of what made it hit, and why, by the end, I started wondering if this story was doing something much bigger than I first thought. The thing I was worried about was not that the segue would be bad, it was that it might not have enough room to matter. Because this segue released in a very strange position. It came in the same patch as the Edgerunner collab, which was already risky enough, and not just because the collab was popular. The bigger problem is that the Edgerunner story was emotionally heavy, really heavy. It was not just a fun crossover, it was a story about grief, memory, trauma, goodbyes that were never really finished. So by the time I finished it, I needed a moment. Not in a dramatic way, just in that very specific way where a story ends, the screen goes quiet, and you sit there thinking, okay, so apparently the game wanted to hurt me today. So when I remembered that Lahai-Roi still had its own segue in the same patch, I was worried, because no matter how good it was, there was a real chance it would feel smaller by comparison. Not worse, just smaller. Sometimes a story does not fail because it's weak. Sometimes it just arrives right after something so emotionally intense that your brain has not fully reset yet. And that would have been a real problem here, because Edgerunners is loud emotionally, it's immediate. This Lahai-Roi story is different, it's quieter, more reflective, it's not trying to break you in the same way. It's asking you to sit with a place, with its people, and with the question of what remains after the main dream of that region starts changing. And that kind of story needs space. Which is why, intentional or not, I think the few days between the Edgerunner story and the segue helped a lot. It gave the collab room to land, it gave players time to process that emotional ending, and when the Lahai-Roi segue arrived, it did not have to compete with that feeling directly, it would create its own. That is the part I found interesting. Even though both stories are technically part of the same patch, they did not feel like they were fighting for the same emotional space. The Edgerunner collab got to be this devastating goodbye, and Lahai-Roi got to be something else, a slower epilogue, a quieter goodbye, not just to one character, but maybe to something larger. That is why the timing mattered so much. This segue was never going to hit the same way Edgerunners did, and it did not need to. It needed the player to come in with a clearer head, and once I did, that is when the story started working for me. Because what I found was not just a small character chapter for Lucila, it was a story about the Rebel College, the students, and the future of Lahai-Roi itself. But the story does not become bigger by leaving Lucila behind, it becomes bigger through her. And I have to be honest, when she was first introduced in Lahai-Roi, I did not fully know what to make of her. She was not exactly cold-hearted, I don't think that is the right word, but she did feel like someone who was practical in a way that could easily become dangerous, like someone who might put her own position or the interest of the Rebel College above the students themselves if the situation demanded it. Maybe that was not completely fair, but that was the impression I had at first, and that is why the segue worked so well for me, because it does not just say, actually Lucila cares, it slowly peels back why she cares, and once you see that, her whole character starts feeling different. The Memory Palace is probably the clearest example of that. It's not just a cool ability, it's character writing. It takes something internal, her memories, her regrets, her attachments, the people she could not let go of, and turns it into a space we can actually walk through. And what do we find there? Students, again and again, students. Not ambition, not power, not control. Students. That is the part that made her click for me. By the end of this segue, Lucila does not feel like someone who sees the Rebel College as an institution first. She sees it as a place built out of people. People she taught, people she protected, people she failed, people she loved. And that is also where the story gets much darker than I expected. At first, this segue starts with a lighter tone, almost comedic in places, and then slowly, the story begins showing what is actually buried underneath that. The student who died in the experiment, the emotional weight of the memory palace, the idea that Lucila's love for her students is not clean or simple. It's mixed with guilt, with responsibility, with the pain of knowing that the path she helped create can also hurt the people who follow it. That makes her final struggle much stronger. She knows the Rebel College has to change. She knows it cannot just stay frozen in the past. But she also knows that continuing its legacy means letting the students keep walking a dangerous path. And that is a hard thing to carry. Even then, Lucila is only half of why this works. The other half is the students themselves. And honestly, this might be the part I appreciated the most. These are not just playable characters getting emotional scenes because they are on the banner. A lot of the emotional weight here comes from ordinary students, NPCs, characters the game could have easily treated like background decoration. But it does not. It gives them time, it lets them speak, it lets them have fears, regrets, pride, and attachment to this place. And that matters because the Rebel College is not just a setting, it's their identity. For so many of them, this was the dream, even if they knew they might never become the Exosrider pilot, even if they knew they were only prospects, even if some of them understood that, in the larger machine, they were basically one small cog. That does not make the dream meaningless. If anything, it makes it more human. Because not everyone gets to become the chosen one, not everyone reaches the top. Most people are the ones trying, failing, hoping, and still choosing to belong to something bigger than themselves. And that is what this story understands. The students are not important because they are powerful. They are important because they show what Lahai-Roi meant to ordinary people. This is why the Rebel College losing its original purpose hits as hard as it does. It's not just a school trying to survive, it's a whole community asking, what are we now? The Exosrider is gone. The old dream has changed. The reason this place existed is no longer the same. So what remains? And the answer the story gives is not simple. It's not, everything will be fine. It's more like, we know this path is dangerous, we know this might hurt us, but this is still the path we choose. That is what makes Lucila's final speech work. It's not just her making a decision for the students, it's the students standing with her, fully aware of what that choice means. They know the risks, they know the history, they know this path has already cost people their lives, and still, they chose it, not blindly, not because the story needs a motivational moment, but because the Rebel College is part of who they are. This is why this ended up being much more than Lucila's story. Lucila gives the segue its heart, but the students give it its scale. Together they turn the Rebel College from a location into something that feels alive, and once that clicked, the whole story started feeling bigger. This was not just about saving a school, it was about preserving the soul of Lahai-Roi. Once the story had that scale, the title Lucila's Segue started feeling too small. Because yes, Lucila is important, she is the emotional center of the story, but by the end I did not feel like the story was only closing her arc. I felt like it was closing Lahai-Roi. Not literally, of course, the region is still there, the characters are still there, the world keeps moving, but emotionally, this felt like the epilogue. And I think that matters a lot, because this is one of the hardest things for a game like Wuthering Waves to do well. When your story is structured around moving from one region to another, it's very easy for each region to start feeling temporary. You arrive, you meet the main cast, you solve the main crisis, you get the big cinematic ending, and then the story basically says, anyway, pack your bags, new region. Which is not always a bad thing. That kind of forward momentum is part of the appeal. But the danger is that regions can start feeling like chapters the game leaves behind instead of places that actually reached an ending. And I think Wuthering Waves had struggled with that before, not because the regions were bad, not because the stories had no strong moments, but because sometimes the ending of an arc felt more like the plot was done using that place rather than the place itself getting emotional closure. That's what Lahai-Roi feels different to me. The segue does not just move us away from the region, it lets the region breathe one last time. It asks one final question: what remains when the old dream changes? And because the story already made Lucila, the students, and the Rebel College feel alive, the question actually lands. The answer is not clean. The Rebel College does not suddenly become safe, the past doesn't stop hurting, and the student's choice does not erase what this path has already caused. But that's why the ending works. It feels true to Lahai-Roi: ambition, risk, knowledge, freedom. The pride of choosing your own path even when that path is dangerous. This is where I think Wuthering Waves has improved again. In a life service story, moving forward is easy. There is always another path, another region, another crisis, another character waiting to take the spotlight. But giving a place a satisfying goodbye, this is much harder. It's the same reason a book in a series still needs its own ending. Yes, the larger story continues. Yes, the next book is coming. But if this part of the journey does not feel complete, then the whole thing starts to feel unfinished. That's what this segue avoids. It does not just say, Lahai-Roi is over now. It shows us what Lahai-Roi meant. It takes Lucila's memories, the student's choice, the Rebel College, the Exosrider's absence, and the future of that region, and it pulls all of that into one final emotional statement. This was Lahai-Roi, not just the politics, not just the lore, not just the main conflict, but the people who believed in it, the people who were hurt by it, the people who still chose it anyway. And honestly, that is what made this story hit for me. Not as hard as Edgerunners, not in the same way, but it was not trying to. Edgerunners was a wound, this was closure, and by the end, I think that is why the segue worked so well. It did not need to be louder, it did not need to be more devastating, it just needed to make Lahai-Roi feel complete, and for me, it did. So yeah, I went into this expecting Lucila's segue, but I think what we actually got was Lahai-Roi's epilogue. And if Wuthering Waves can keep giving its regions this kind of emotional closure moving forward, then that is a very good sign for the future of its storytelling. This is how a region should end, not by disappearing when the plot is done with it, but by leaving behind a feeling strong enough that you understand why it mattered in the first place. So what do you think? Did this feel like Lahai-Roi's epilogue to you too? Did Lucila's story work better than you expected? And do you think Wuthering Waves is getting better at giving its regions actual closure? Anyway, that's gonna be all from me for this one. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.